The strangest thing about betrayal is not the moment it happens. It is the silence that follows. Silence has a way of revealing truths that words spend years trying to hide. James never imagined that a single sentence could erase 5 years of memories. Yet, that was exactly what happened. The morning sunlight reflected from the glass walls of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. The city looked alive. People hurried across sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands. Cars filled the streets. Somewhere, musicians played outside the subway entrance. Everything looked ordinary. Everything except James. James stood alone beside a marble fountain, adjusting the sleeve of a navy blue suit that Emma had once said made James look like the safest place in the world. James smiled at that memory. For only a second, inside the hotel ballroom, workers were decorating for an important charity gala. Emma had invited James weeks earlier. It's one of the biggest nights of my career. Emma had said over dinner, I want James beside Emma when everyone important finally sees what James and Emma have built together. James believed every word. After all, James had believed Emma for years. James had believed the late-night promises, the plan for a wedding, the conversations about buying a small house near the lake, the dreams of raising children one day. James believed love was built through consistency, not grand speeches. Maybe that was James' first mistake. James checked the time. Emma was late. Not unusual. Emma always said success required sacrifice. James never complained. Waiting for someone you love never feels like waiting. It feels like hope. Finally, the revolving hotel door opened. Emma stepped inside, wearing a black evening dress that looked as though it belonged on the cover of a magazine. For a brief moment, James forgot to breathe. Emma looked beautiful, but something felt different. Emma didn't smile. Emma didn't rush over. Emma didn't even look relieved to see James. Instead, Emma walked slowly toward James with an expression that felt colder than the Chicago winter outside. James noticed something else. A tall man in an expensive gray suit followed a few steps behind Emma, confident, relaxed, as though the hotel belonged to him. James had never seen him before. Emma. James smiled gently. You look incredible. Emma glanced around before answering. James, we need to talk. The words sounded ordinary, but James immediately felt something sinking inside. People rarely say those words before changing someone's life forever. James nodded. What's wrong? Emma looked toward the ballroom entrance. More guests were arriving. Business executives, investors, television reporters. Emma took a slow breath. Then came the sentence James would never forget. Tonight, Emma needs James to pretend James and Emma have never met. James blinked. For a second, the world simply stopped. The traffic outside disappeared. The conversations faded. Even the fountain behind them seemed silent. James stared at Emma. What? Emma avoided eye contact. Please don't make this harder. James laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the human mind often laughs before accepting pain. James doesn't understand. Emma folded Emma's arms. Some very important people are here tonight. James nodded slowly. So. Emma hesitated. My engagement, our relationship. Emma swallowed. It could become a problem. James felt every heartbeat echo inside James' chest. A problem? Emma looked embarrassed. They don't know about James. James frowned. They? Emma glanced toward the man in the gray suit. The board members. James followed Emma's eyes. The man smiled politely. Too politely. Emma continued speaking. They think Emma is completely focused on building the company. James remained silent. So Emma wants James to disappear. It's only for tonight. Only. Such a small word. Such enormous damage. James looked at the engagement ring inside the small velvet box hidden in a coat pocket. Emma had never seen it. James planned to propose after the gala ended. James had imagined fireworks by the river, a quiet dinner, Emma crying happy tears, a lifetime beginning. Instead, James slowly closed the ring box again. No anger, no shouting, no desperate questions, only silence. Emma looked almost relieved. Thank you for understanding. James finally spoke. Did Emma ever plan to tell everyone James existed? Emma hesitated. I don't know. Those 3 words hurt more than any insult could have. I don't know. Not yes. Not someday. Not after tonight. Simply, I don't know. The man in the gray suit finally approached. Emma. Emma smiled instantly. A smile James hadn't seen in weeks. The man offered Emma his arm. Everyone's waiting. Emma nodded. Before leaving, Emma looked back one last time. I'm sorry. James looked into Emma's eyes. For the first time in 5 years, James saw no home there, only distance. Emma turned around and disappeared into ballroom. The doors closed. James remained standing outside, completely alone. Many people believe strength is measured by reaction. That strength is raising your voice, demanding answers, fighting for respect. James had once believed that too. But something changed that night, because the strongest people often understand something the world forgets. Not every battle deserves a soldier. Some doors become easier to close and to keep knocking on forever. James placed the unopened engagement ring back into a pocket. Without another word, James walked away. Not because James stopped loving Emma, but because James finally started respecting James. Outside, the evening sky had turned dark. The wind carried the smell of rain. James wandered through quiet streets without knowing where to go. The city lights reflected across the river like broken memories. Every place reminded James of Emma. The coffee shop where James and Emma had spent rainy afternoons. The bookstore where Emma secretly bought James a first edition of a favorite novel. The park bench where Emma once whispered, "No matter what happens, Emma will always choose James." Funny, promises never sound like lies while they're being made. James reached the river and stopped walking. The water moved calmly, never rushing, never looking back. An elderly man feeding birds nearby noticed James staring into the darkness. Without introducing himself, the old man quietly said, "Water teaches a lesson most people ignore." James looked over. The old man smiled gently. It never argues with a stone blocking its path. It simply finds another way. James didn't answer. The stranger tossed another handful of bread into the river. The quietest rivers usually reach the ocean first. James watched the current carry the pieces away. For the first time that evening, James realized silence was not weakness. Silence was direction. And somewhere inside that silence, a different version of James had just taken the first step into existence. The next morning, Chicago woke to another busy day. Traffic filled the streets. Coffee shops opened before sunrise. People rushed toward meetings they believed would change their lives. James walked through the same city. But James no longer felt like the same person. Some betrayals don't break your heart immediately. They break your identity. For years, James had built every plan around Emma. Every promotion, every vacation, every dream. Now, for the first time in 5 years, James had no destination, only questions. James returned to the apartment just after sunrise. The place was quiet, almost painfully quiet. Emma's favorite coffee mug still sat beside the sink. A blue sweater Emma always left on the couch remained exactly where Emma had forgotten it 2 days earlier. Photographs lined the hallway. Weekend trips, Christmas mornings, beach vacations, smiling faces, perfect moments, or at least moments James believed were perfect. James stood in front of the largest photograph. Emma rested Emma's head against James' shoulder. Both of them were laughing. James reached toward the frame, then stopped. The picture hadn't lied. The people inside it had simply changed. James placed the unopened engagement ring on the kitchen table. For several minutes, James stared at the small velvet box. It suddenly felt much heavier than gold should. Slowly, James opened it. The diamond sparkled as brightly as it had the day James bought it. Nothing about the ring had changed. Everything about its meaning had. James whispered to the empty apartment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Silence answered. Sometimes silence is the only honest response life can give. James picked up the phone. Emma had sent exactly one message. "I'm sorry about last night. James will understand someday." No explanation. No phone call. No request to meet. Only 12 words. James read the message again. Then again. Strangely, the more James read it, the less it sounded like an apology. It sounded like permission. Permission for Emma to avoid guilt. Permission for Emma to move forward without consequences. James locked the phone. No reply. Not because James wanted revenge. Because not every message deserves an answer. Hours passed. James cleaned the apartment, folded clothes, organized books, watered the small plants near the window. Simple tasks, simple movements. But inside, every memory fought for attention. Emma laughing during movie nights. Emma dancing while cooking dinner. Emma falling asleep with a book resting across Emma's chest. The memories weren't fake. That was what made them painful. People rarely pretend for years. Sometimes, they simply become someone different. That afternoon, James drove toward the jewelry store. The engagement ring rested inside the center console. The entire drive, James remembered the day it had been purchased. The salesperson had smiled warmly. Planning to propose? James had smiled back. The love of James' life. The words echoed inside James' mind like someone else's voice. Inside the store, the same salesperson recognized James immediately. A bright smile appeared. Did everything go well? James looked at the ring, then quietly placed a velvet box onto the glass counter. I won't be needing this anymore. The salesperson's smile faded. No questions. No awkward sympathy. Only understanding. Sometimes strangers know exactly when silence is kinder than conversation. After finishing the paperwork, the salesperson gently pushed the receipt across the counter. I'm sorry. James nodded. So is James. Then James walked away. Not richer. Not poorer. Simply lighter. That evening, James visited the lake. Cold wind rolled across the water. The waves crashed softly against the rocks. People walked nearby holding hands. Some laughed. Some argued. Some stared at the sunset together. Without saying anything, James realized something. Love itself had never betrayed James. One person had. Those are very different things. Bitterness often begins when people confuse the two. As darkness settled over the city, James noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a wooden bench. The same man from the river the night before. The man looked up and smiled. I wondered if James would come. James frowned slightly. You knew James would? The old man chuckled. No, but pain usually returns people to quiet places. James sat beside the stranger. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt strangely peaceful. Finally, the old man asked, why does Emma still control James? James looked confused. Emma doesn't. The old man nodded toward James' tightly closed fist. Then why is James still carrying yesterday? James slowly opened the hand. Without realizing it, James had been gripping the jewelry store receipt. The paper had become wrinkled. The old man smiled gently. The hands often reveal what the heart refuses to admit. James stared across the dark water. What if forgetting Emma means losing part of James? The old man shook his head. No, forgetting pain isn't wisdom. Learning from pain is... James listened carefully. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that other people's actions belong to them. The response belongs to us. Emma made Emma's choice. Now James must make James. James remained silent. Those words felt heavier than advice. They felt like responsibility. For the first time since the gala, James asked a question that truly mattered. What if Emma comes back? The old man smiled sadly. The better question is, will James still be standing where Emma left James? The answer arrived before James could speak. No, something inside James had already started moving. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. Days turned into weeks. James stopped checking Emma's social media, stopped rereading old messages, stopped wondering who Emma was with. Each habit disappeared one decision at a time. Healing wasn't dramatic. Healing was ordinary. Wake up, go to work, read another page, take another walk, sleep, repeat. Small victories rarely make headlines, but they build extraordinary lives. One Friday afternoon, James received a call from an old college friend. James, we're opening a leadership position in our Seattle office. James leaned back in a chair. Seattle? Yeah. Bigger salary. New team. Fresh start. James looked through the office window. The Chicago skyline stretched into the distance. Every street held a memory. Every corner whispered Emma's name. Perhaps the city wasn't keeping James trapped. Perhaps James had been holding on to the city. I'll think about it. That night, James stood one last time outside the apartment balcony. The lights below shimmered like countless possibilities. James finally understood something. Strength wasn't pretending nothing happened. Strength wasn't proving Emma wrong. Strength wasn't waiting for an apology. Real strength was quietly choosing a future that no longer depended on the person who walked away. The wind carried away the last traces of yesterday, and for the first time, James smiled without remembering Emma first. It was only a small smile, but every new beginning starts with something small. 3 weeks passed. James never called Emma. Emma never called James. The silence between James and Emma grew so deep that it no longer felt empty. It felt permanent. Most people think silence is waiting, but true silence is a decision. James had stopped waiting. Seattle welcomed James with cold mornings, endless rain, and a skyline completely different from Chicago. Everything was unfamiliar. The apartment was smaller. The streets had different names. The cafes served different coffee. No place reminded James of Emma. For the first time in years, James could breathe without memories following every step. Sometimes healing doesn't begin inside the heart. Sometimes it begins with changing the view outside the window. The new office overlooked Elliott Bay. Modern, quiet, professional. James had accepted the leadership position because it offered more than a higher salary. It offered distance. On the first day, employees greeted James politely. Some introduced themselves. Some smiled nervously. Others immediately respected James' calm confidence. James noticed something strange. People listened more when James spoke less. Months earlier, James would have tried to impress everyone. Now, James simply focused on doing the work. The results spoke louder than introductions ever could. Every morning followed the same routine. Wake before sunrise. Exercise. Read 20 pages from a philosophy book. Drink black coffee. Arrive at work early. Leave on time. Walk along the waterfront before going home. Simple habits. Repeat it every day. James realized discipline was replacing heartbreak, little by little, without asking permission. One evening, while organizing old boxes, James found a notebook Emma had given James on the second anniversary of their relationship. Inside the cover, Emma had written, "No matter where life takes James and Emma believes James and Emma will always find each other." James stared at the handwriting. Months ago, those words would have shattered James. Now, James simply smiled, not because the words were true, because they had once been. People often judge the past by the ending. James no longer did. James carefully closed the notebook and placed it back inside the box. Some memories deserve respect, not because they should control the future, because they helped shape the person standing today. Work became busier. James led meetings with quiet confidence. Instead of demanding attention, James earned it. One afternoon, a younger employee entered James' office. Nervous? James asked. The young man nodded. "I've never presented in front of executives." James remembered feeling exactly the same years earlier. James smiled gently. Speak to solve problems, not to impress people. The young man looked surprised. "That's it." James nodded. If people remember the truth, they won't care how loudly James said it. The presentation became a success. The employee later thanked James. James simply replied, "Confidence grows through preparation, not applause." 6 months passed. James rarely thought about Emma. Not because James forced the memories away, because life had become too full to leave room for regret. Then, everything changed. Late one Friday afternoon, James' phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. James almost ignored it. Almost. Hello. Silence. Then, A voice James recognized immediately. James. Emma. James closed the office door. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Emma whispered, "James sounds different." James looked out the window toward the gray Seattle sky. "So does Emma." Emma gave a nervous laugh. I wasn't sure James would answer. I almost didn't. Another silence. Longer this time. Emma took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about James." James remained calm. "Why?" The question caught Emma off guard. Months earlier, James would have asked dozens of questions. Now, only one mattered. Emma hesitated. "A lot has happened. I'm sure. I miss talking to James." James leaned against the desk. The conversation ended the night Emma asked James to disappear. Emma's breathing became heavier. "I know. I'm sorry." James listened carefully. The apology sounded genuine, but something felt incomplete. An apology explains the past. It doesn't automatically deserve the future. Emma spoke again. "Can James and Emma meet?" James closed the eyes for a brief moment. The old James would have agreed immediately. The new James asked, "Why?" Emma didn't answer right away. Finally, "I need James." Those 3 words would once have meant everything. Today, they meant very little. Need wasn't the same as love. Need wasn't the same as respect. Need often appeared only after convenience disappeared. James calmly replied. Emma didn't need James at the hotel. The line went silent. James wasn't trying to hurt Emma. James was simply telling the truth. Truth often sounds cruel to people who expected comfort instead. Emma quietly said, "James has every reason to be angry." James looked toward the rain falling outside. "I'm not angry." Emma sounded surprised. "Then what is James?" James answered without hesitation. "At peace." Emma didn't speak, because some answers cannot be argued with. After another minute, Emma softly asked, "Is there someone else?" James smiled. "No." "Then why won't James meet Emma?" James thought carefully before answering. Because James finally learned something. What? Walking away isn't always giving up. Sometimes it's choosing yourself. Emma quietly cried on the other end of the phone. James heard every tear. Months earlier, those tears would have broken James. Today, James felt compassion, not temptation. There's a difference. Emma whispered, "I never stopped loving James." James closed the eyes. Those words arrived too late. Love that hides when life becomes inconvenient isn't strong enough to build a future. James answered gently, "Maybe Emma believes that." But James had to learn to stop loving the version of Emma that only existed in James' memories. Emma began sobbing. "Please, can James and Emma at least talk?" James looked across the office. Employees laughed together outside the glass walls. Life continued, without waiting for anyone's unfinished story. James spoke softly. "I hope Emma finds peace." Then James ended the call. No anger, no revenge, no final speech, just silence. That evening, James walked along the waterfront as the sun disappeared behind the Olympic Mountains. The wind was cold, but James felt lighter than ever. Strength wasn't found in proving Emma wrong. Strength wasn't found in making Emma regret the past. Strength was quietly refusing to reopen a door that had taken every ounce of courage to close. As waves rolled against the shore, James finally understood one of life's hardest lessons. The strongest people don't always win the argument. Sometimes, the strongest people simply stop returning to the battlefield. Almost a year passed. Time moved quietly. Not because life had become easier, because James had stopped measuring every day against the past. Seattle no longer felt like a temporary escape. It had become home. The apartment overlooking Elliott Bay was filled with books instead of unopened moving boxes. The mornings were peaceful. The nights were calm. For the first time in years, James wasn't surviving. James was living. Success arrived slowly. Then, all at once, the company promoted James to regional director after leading several projects that others believed would fail. James never celebrated loudly. While others chased recognition, James chased excellence. Recognition simply followed. One afternoon, The company CEO stopped outside James' office. "I've been watching James." James looked up from a report. "I hope that's a good thing." The CEO smiled. James never argues. James never takes credit. And somehow, James always delivers results. James remained quiet. The CEO continued. "Do James know why people trust James?" James shook the head. "Because James doesn't need everyone to notice James." The CEO walked away. James sat silently for several minutes. The compliment meant more than any award. Real respect is earned in silence. That evening, James received another call from an unknown number. James almost ignored it. Instead, James answered. "Hello." The voice wasn't Emma's. It belonged to Daniel, the man in the gray suit from the charity gala. James recognized the voice immediately. "James." "Yes." "This is Daniel." James waited. "I know who Daniel is." Daniel sighed. "I owe James an explanation." James looked through the apartment window. "The explanation is a year late." "I know, but James deserves the truth." James almost ended the call. Almost. Instead, James listened. Daniel's voice sounded tired. The night of the gala, Emma wasn't trying to impress investors. James frowned. Then why did Emma ask James to pretend James and Emma had never met? Daniel took a long breath. Because Daniel told Emma to. The room became perfectly still. James didn't interrupt. Daniel continued. Daniel convinced Emma that publicly being engaged would hurt Emma's chances of becoming CEO. Daniel promised Emma that after the promotion, everything could return to normal. James closed the eyes. So Emma chose a promotion. Daniel answered honestly. "Yes." James wasn't surprised. "Not anymore." "But that's not the whole story," Daniel said. James remained silent. The board never asked Emma to hide James. James slowly opened the eyes. "What?" Nobody on the board cared. The decision came from Daniel. James frowned. "Why?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "Because Daniel was selfish." James said nothing. Daniel's voice grew heavier. Daniel had feelings for Emma. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Daniel quietly admitted. Daniel believed that if James disappeared long enough, Emma would eventually choose Daniel. James looked out toward the dark water beyond the window. So Daniel manipulated Emma. "Yes." And Emma allowed it. "Yes." The truth was finally complete. Painful. Simple. Undeniable. Daniel spoke again. Emma realized a mistake too late. James didn't answer. After James left Chicago, Emma refused every promotion Daniel offered. James remained quiet. Emma ended every friendship with Daniel. James still said nothing. Emma even resigned from the company 6 months ago. James looked surprised. Daniel continued. Emma said success wasn't worth becoming someone Emma couldn't respect. For the first time during the conversation, James asked a question. "Why tell James now?" Daniel laughed quietly. "Because Daniel is dying." James froze. The words didn't register immediately. "What?" "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer." The doctors believe Daniel has less than a year. James closed the eyes. Every emotion inside James suddenly became complicated. Anger, sympathy, confusion, compassion. Daniel spoke gently. James doesn't have to forgive Daniel. Daniel isn't asking for that. Daniel only wants James to know Emma wasn't completely heartless. Emma made a terrible decision. But Emma has spent every day since trying to become a better person. James leaned back in the chair. The silence between the two men lasted almost a full minute. Finally, James asked, "Does Emma know Daniel is calling?" "No. Emma would never allow it." James nodded slowly. That sounded like the Emma James once knew. Not the Emma from the hotel. Perhaps people really could change. But another thought immediately followed. Change doesn't erase consequences. Before ending the call, Daniel quietly said, "James." "Yes." If Daniel could live that night again, Daniel would walk past Emma without saying a single word. James answered honestly, "I believe Daniel." Daniel smiled sadly. "Sometimes." The worst punishment isn't losing everything. It's living long enough to understand why. The call ended. James placed the phone on the table. The apartment became silent once again. James walked onto the balcony. Rain drifted across the city lights. For the first time in over a year, James cried, not because James still wanted Emma back, not because Daniel had confessed. James cried because the truth was more tragic than the lie. No villain had destroyed everything. Only pride, fear, ambition, and one terrible choice. How many lives are changed forever by a single decision made in a single moment? The next morning, James visited the waterfront before work. The elderly man who had once fed birds was sitting on the same wooden bench. James smiled. "It's been a while." The old man smiled back. I knew James would return someday. James sat beside the stranger. Without speaking, James watched the waves. Finally, James said, "James finally knows the truth." The old man nodded. "And did the truth bring peace?" James thought carefully. "It brought understanding." The old man smiled. "Understanding is heavier than anger, but much lighter than hatred." James nodded. Emma was manipulated. Daniel admitted everything. The old man listened quietly. After a long silence, the stranger asked, "Does knowing that change what happened?" James looked toward the endless water. "No." "Does it change the person James became?" James smiled softly. "No." The old man stood. "Then the truth has already done everything it was supposed to do." As the old man walked away, James remained on the bench, watching the tide, watching the horizon, watching another chapter of life quietly begin. James realized something profound. Sometimes, life doesn't reveal the truth to bring people back together. Sometimes, life reveals the truth so that the heart can finally stop asking questions. And for the first time since leaving Chicago, James felt no desire to look back, only gratitude that James had found the strength to keep walking forward. 2 years passed. Time did what time always does. It kept moving. The seasons changed. Rain gave way to sunshine. Summer returned to Seattle. Then autumn painted the streets gold once again. Life no longer revolved around what James had lost. It revolved around who James was becoming. The pain had not disappeared. It had simply become wisdom. James' career continued to grow. The company expanded into new markets, and James was chosen to lead the largest project in its history. The responsibility was enormous. So was the pressure. But pressure no longer frightened James. Pressure had introduced James to a stronger version of himself. Each morning began before sunrise. Exercise, meditation, reading, work, evening walks along the waterfront. The routine never changed. People often asked James the secret behind such consistency. James always gave the same answer. Discipline is easier than regret. Most people smiled. Very few understood. One Friday afternoon, James received an unexpected package at the office. There was no return address. Only James' name written neatly across the front. James carried it into the office and slowly opened it. Inside was a small wooden box. Beneath the lid rested an envelope. On the front were only 4 words. For James. Only James. James recognized the handwriting immediately. Emma. James stared at the envelope for several seconds. A year ago, James would have opened it without hesitation. Now, James wasn't sure. Some doors deserved to remain closed. Yet something inside whispered, "Read it." Not for Emma. For closure. James carefully unfolded the letter. James. Emma doesn't know whether James will ever read this. Maybe James already threw away. Maybe that's exactly what Emma deserves. But Emma needs to tell the truth one last time. James continued reading. The night of the gala has replayed inside Emma's mind every single day. Emma thought success would make everything easier. Instead, success became the loneliest place Emma has ever stood. Every promotion reminded Emma of what Emma had traded to earn it. James quietly lowered the letter. Outside the office window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Then James continued. Daniel manipulated Emma. That part is true. But Daniel never forced Emma. to choose ambition over love. That decision belonged to Emma. Emma accepts that completely. James closed the eyes. Those words mattered, not because they erased the past, because they refused to hide from it. Real accountability never searches for excuses. The letter continued. After James left Chicago, Emma spent months hoping James would call. Then Emma realized something painful. Emma had asked James to disappear. James simply respected Emma's decision. A single tear landed on the paper. James quickly wiped it away. Not because James wanted Emma back, because honesty always carries its own weight. Emma's handwriting grew shakier. The hardest lesson wasn't losing James. The hardest lesson was discovering the kind of person Emma became while chasing success. Emma stopped recognizing Emma. Money couldn't fix that. Awards couldn't fix that. Nothing could. James remembered the confident woman who had walked into the gala. She had believed success required sacrifice. She never imagined she would become the sacrifice. The final page contained only a few paragraphs. Daniel is gone. James froze. The words blurred for a moment. Daniel had passed away. Quietly, without ever asking for forgiveness again. James lowered the letter. A strange sadness settled inside. Daniel had made terrible choices. But Daniel had also accepted responsibility before the end. Not everyone finds the courage to do that. James continued reading. Before Daniel died, Daniel gave Emma something. An envelope. Inside was a photograph from the gala. James never knew it existed. Someone had taken a picture just after Emma asked James to disappear. James wasn't looking at Emma. James was looking down. Holding the engagement ring inside James' pocket. The expression on James' face still haunts Emma. Emma has never seen heartbreak look so quiet. James slowly folded the letter. No anger remained, only understanding. At the bottom of the final page, Emma had written one last sentence. Emma doesn't want another chance. Emma only hopes James never doubts that James was deeply loved. No request to meet, no request to reply, no request for forgiveness. Just truth, nothing more. James placed the letter back inside the envelope, then looked across the office. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Years ago, James would have believed this letter changed everything. It didn't. The past remained exactly where it belonged, behind James. But the letter did change one thing. It removed the final shadow of resentment. James no longer carried unanswered questions. That evening, James walked to the waterfront with the letter tucked inside the jacket. The sky glowed orange as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. James sat on a familiar wooden bench. The elderly man wasn't there. Perhaps he had moved. Perhaps life had simply carried him elsewhere. James smiled. Some teachers appear only long enough to leave a lesson. James removed the letter one final time. Read the last sentence again, then carefully folded it. Instead of throwing it into the water, James placed it inside the notebook Emma had given years earlier, not as a symbol of unfinished love. As a reminder, people are capable of extraordinary kindness. They are also capable of extraordinary mistakes. Sometimes, the same person is both. The waves rolled gently against the shore. James realized forgiveness had never been about freeing Emma. Forgiveness had always been about freeing James. Hatred asks us to carry yesterday forever. Wisdom quietly asks us to set it down. James stood and looked toward the endless horizon. For the first time in years, the memory of Emma no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a chapter, an important one, but still only a chapter. And somewhere beyond that horizon, a future James had never imagined was already waiting. When the past knocked one last time. 3 years had passed since the night Emma asked James to pretend James and Emma had never met. Life had become quiet, not empty, peaceful. James had learned that those two things were very different. The apartment overlooking Elliott Bay no longer felt temporary. The walls held books instead of memories. The shelves displayed awards instead of photographs. The silence inside the home was no longer loneliness. It was comfort. James had become one of the youngest executives in the company's history. Success arrived without James chasing it. Every promotion came after years of discipline. Every opportunity followed consistent effort. One afternoon, during a leadership conference in San Francisco, a guest speaker said something that caught everyone's attention. People spend their lives trying to prove themselves to people who stopped thinking about them years ago. The audience applauded. James didn't. James simply smiled, because James already knew. Stoicism had taught James something the business world rarely understood. Validation is expensive. Self-respect costs nothing. After the conference ended, James walked through the hotel lobby. Executives gathered in small groups. Some discussed investments. Others exchanged business cards. James preferred fresh air. As James approached the revolving door, a familiar voice stopped James. James. James froze. Slowly, James turned around. Emma stood only a few feet away. Time had changed Emma, not dramatically. Subtly, the confident smile that once came so easily had become gentler. Emma's eyes carried a quiet sadness, not the sadness of someone seeking pity, the sadness of someone who had lived with regret for a very long time. For several seconds, neither James nor Emma spoke. Emma smiled softly. It's been a long time. James nodded. It has. Emma looked nervous. I almost didn't come over. James replied calmly. Then why did Emma? Emma took a deep breath. Because running away once was enough. James respected the honesty. There was no anger inside, only curiosity. Would James have coffee with Emma? James looked toward the hotel entrance. The sun was beginning to set over San Francisco Bay. Years ago, James would have said yes without thinking. Today, James thought carefully. Finally, James nodded. 1 cup. Emma smiled. 1 cup. The cafe overlooked the water. The atmosphere was quiet. Soft jazz played in the background. For several minutes, neither James nor Emma touched the coffee. Emma finally broke the silence. James looks happy. James answered honestly. James is... Emma smiled. I'm glad. There was no jealousy in Emma's voice, only sincerity. James noticed. People really could change, but change required years, not promises. Emma looked out the window. After James left, Emma spent a long time blaming everyone else. James remained silent. Daniel, the company, the pressure, the board. Emma laughed quietly. It was easier than blaming Emma. James nodded. Most people do that. Emma looked back at James. What made James different? James thought for a moment. Pain. Emma frowned slightly. What does that mean? James smiled. Pain forced James to ask difficult questions. Not about Emma. About James. Emma listened carefully. James continued. James realized something. Emma didn't destroy James. James had built James' entire identity around someone else's approval. When Emma walked away, so did James' identity. Emma looked down. I never wanted that. James nodded. I know. And that's why James forgives Emma. Emma slowly looked up. You do. James smiled gently. James forgave Emma a long time ago. Emma's eyes immediately filled with tears. Not loud tears. Quiet ones. The kind that appear when someone finally stops fighting the truth. Emma whispered. Then why didn't James ever contact Emma? James answered without hesitation. Because forgiveness isn't the same as returning. Emma closed the eyes. I understand. James believed Emma did. After another moment, Emma reached into the purse. I wanted James to have something. Emma placed a small leather notebook on the table. James recognized it immediately. The notebook where James and Emma had once written travel dreams together. Italy, Japan, Alaska, New Zealand. Each destination had represented a promise. Emma gently pushed the notebook across the table. Emma doesn't need it anymore. James looked at it, but didn't pick it up. Why? Emma smiled sadly. Because those dreams belong to James and Emma. They don't belong to Emma alone. James slowly opened the notebook. Most pages were exactly as James remembered. Then, James found dozens of new pages, each filled with handwriting, reflections, mistakes, lessons, regrets. Emma had continued writing for years. The final page simply said, "The hardest journey wasn't across the world. It was becoming someone James would have been proud to love." James quietly closed the notebook. "Emma?" "Yes." James believes Emma finally became that person. Emma immediately began crying, not because James had offered hope, because James had offered peace. There is a difference. The waiter quietly refilled both coffee cups. Neither noticed. The conversation had become something far more valuable than coffee. Emma finally asked a question that had lived inside for years. If life gave James another chance, would James choose Emma again? The cafe became completely silent. James looked out toward the ocean. The waves moved exactly as they always had, never rushing, never stopping. Finally, James answered, "No." Emma closed the eyes. The answer hurt. James could see it. But James continued gently. Not because James hates Emma. Not because Emma isn't a good person. James smiled kindly. Because James wouldn't trade the person James became. Emma nodded slowly. For the first time, Emma understood. Some losses don't exist to punish us. They exist to transform us. If the relationship had survived, neither James nor Emma would have become the people sitting across from each other today. The price had been painful, but the lesson had been priceless. As they walked outside, the evening sky turned shades of orange and purple. Emma stopped before saying goodbye. "Thank James." James smiled. "For what?" "For showing Emma that strength doesn't always fight." James looked toward the ocean. The strongest people stay quiet because they know peace is louder than revenge. Emma smiled through the tears, then quietly walked away. James didn't watch Emma leave. James simply turned toward the horizon and continued walking forward, because some endings don't require one last look. They simply require one last step. The hardest part of rebuilding a life is not finding a new path. It is believing that a new path deserves to exist. For years, James believed happiness had one face, one future, one name, Emma. When that future disappeared, James believed happiness had disappeared with it. James had been wrong. Life has a strange habit of rewarding the people who stop demanding that it unfold according to their plans. 6 months passed after James and Emma met in San Francisco. Neither James nor Emma called. Neither sent a message. There were no birthday wishes. No holiday greetings. No late-night conversations. Nothing. Not because there was hatred between James and Emma. Because respect had finally replaced attachment. Sometimes the kindest thing two people can do for each other is allow each other to continue growing separately. Seattle was entering another autumn. Golden leaves drifted across quiet streets. The air smelled of rain and cedar trees. James followed the same morning routine that had become the foundation of life. Wake before sunrise. Exercise. Read. Work. Walk. Reflect. Repeat. Many people considered the routine boring. James considered it freedom. Discipline removed the need for constant motivation. When habits became strong, emotions no longer controlled every decision. One Monday morning, James received an invitation to speak at a national leadership summit. The organizers wanted successful executives to share lessons about resilience, leadership, and personal growth. James almost declined. Public speaking had never been appealing. James preferred listening, but the CEO smiled. People don't need another loudspeaker. They need someone who has actually lived through failure. James accepted, not to impress strangers, to serve them. The conference hall was filled with hundreds of business leaders, entrepreneurs, university students, and journalists. Bright lights illuminated the stage. A large screen displayed James' name. As James stepped toward the podium, the audience applauded. James waited until the room became completely quiet. Then James spoke. Years ago, James lost the person James believed would become James' entire future. The room became silent. I thought losing one relationship meant losing life itself. I was wrong. People leaned forward, not because James spoke dramatically, because James spoke honestly. James continued. Most people believe strength means fighting harder, arguing louder, winning every battle. James slowly looked across the audience. But the strongest decision James ever made was quietly walking away from someone who no longer chose James. The room remained perfectly still. No phones, no whispers, only listening. James told the story. Not every detail, not every wound, only the lessons. How pride destroys trust, how silence reveals character, how discipline rebuilds identity, how forgiveness frees the person offering it. James never mentioned Emma's name. James protected Emma's dignity. Even after everything, that decision mattered more than the audience realized. Character is revealed by how we speak about people who are no longer present to defend themselves. When the speech ended, the applause lasted several minutes. James quietly thanked the audience and stepped off the stage. As James entered the backstage hallway, a young man hurried over. He looked no older than 23. "Mr. James." James smiled. "Just James." The young man nodded nervously. "I almost didn't come today." James listened. "My fiancée left me 3 months ago." James said nothing. The young man continued. "I was angry. I wanted revenge. I wanted James to know what losing someone felt like." He looked down, but after hearing James speak, I realized the only person James was destroying was James. Tears filled the young man's eyes. "Thank James." James placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "No, thank the pain." The young man looked confused. James smiled gently. Pain introduced James to wisdom. If life had stayed comfortable, James would never have learned. That conversation stayed with James for days. For the first time, James understood something unexpected. The story was never only about Emma. It was never only about betrayal. The story had become useful. The suffering that once seemed meaningless was now helping complete strangers. Nothing in life is truly wasted if it becomes wisdom. Weeks later, James received another unexpected phone call. This time, it came from Daniel's younger sister, Sarah. James remembered meeting Sarah only once, years ago. "James." "Yes." Daniel left something for James. James remained quiet. "A journal." James frowned. "A journal?" Sarah answered softly. "Daniel wrote during the last months of life. There are several pages addressed to James." James hesitated. Why didn't Sarah send it sooner? Sarah sighed. Daniel asked Sarah to wait until James had completely moved on. James looked out the office window. Moved on. What a complicated phrase. Finally, James answered. "Send it." A week later, the package arrived. The journal was old. Its leather cover showed signs of heavy use. James opened the first page. Most entries described Daniel's treatments. Fear, regret, loneliness. But near the end, Daniel had written directly to James. If James is reading this, then Daniel hopes James has already found peace. James turned the page. Daniel spent years believing success meant possessing everything Daniel wanted. Daniel eventually learned that real success is becoming someone capable of sleeping peacefully at night. James continued reading. Daniel stole nothing from James. Daniel only exposed the weaknesses already hiding inside everyone involved. James paused. Those words were difficult, but true. The final page contained one sentence written in shaky handwriting. The strongest people stay quiet because they no longer need the world to agree with the truth. James closed the journal. Daniel had died with many regrets, but Daniel had not died unchanged. Perhaps that was enough. That evening, James stood on the balcony overlooking the Seattle skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the stars. James realized life had become something unimaginable. Not perfect, peaceful. There would always be scars. But scars no longer represented weakness. They represented survival. James looked toward the horizon and quietly smiled. Years earlier, Emma had asked James to pretend James and Emma had never met. At the time, it felt like the cruelest request imaginable. Now, James understood. If that night had never happened, James would never have discovered the strength hidden beneath the heartbreak. Sometimes the worst day of your life quietly becomes the first day of your real life. 5 years had passed. The night at the charity gala no longer felt like yesterday. It felt like another lifetime. James was no longer the man who had stood outside those ballroom doors with an engagement ring hidden inside a pocket. That version of James had disappeared. Not because pain erased James, because pain refined James. Fire never asked permission before changing steel. Life doesn't ask either. Seattle had become more than home. It had become proof. Proof that peace could exist after heartbreak. Proof that silence could become strength. Proof that a person could lose everything they planned and still build something even greater. James rarely spoke about the past anymore. There was no need. The people closest to James never knew the full story. They only knew the man standing in front of them. Calm, patient, reliable. They admired James' confidence. Very few understood the years of loneliness that had created it. One crisp autumn morning, James received an invitation unlike any before. The University of Washington wanted James to deliver the keynote speech for graduating business students. The theme was simple. Leadership begins within. James accepted, not because standing on a stage was enjoyable, because someone in that audience might be living through the same pain James once believed would never end. The auditorium was filled with graduates and proud families. Laughter echoed through the halls. Parents held cameras. Students dreamed about futures they couldn't yet imagine. James stood backstage, looking at the audience through a small opening in the curtain. 5 years ago, James would have been terrified. Today, James simply felt grateful. Grateful for every mistake, every disappointment, every tear, because each one had quietly carried James toward this moment. The announcer smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Carter." The audience applauded. James stepped onto the stage. The room slowly became quiet. James looked across hundreds of hopeful faces, then spoke. "Everyone in this room has a plan." Soft laughter spread through the audience. James smiled. So did James. More laughter. Then James continued. "The problem with plans. They assume life will ask permission before changing them." The room became completely silent. James told the graduates about ambition, about discipline, about responsibility. Then James paused. There was a time when James believed another person was responsible for James' happiness. Several students nodded. They understood. When that person walked away, James believed happiness walked away too. James slowly looked across the room. But happiness had never belonged to another person. It had only been borrowed. Real happiness begins the day you stop asking someone else to carry your peace. After the speech ended, dozens of graduates waited to thank James. Some wanted advice. Others wanted photographs. One young woman stood quietly near the back of the line. She never moved. When everyone else left, she approached. "Mr. Carter." James smiled. "Just James." The young woman smiled nervously. "My name is Olivia." James shook Olivia's hand. What can James do for Olivia? Olivia looked embarrassed. "Nothing. I only wanted to say." James helped Olivia make a decision today. James waited. Olivia continued. "Olivia has been holding on to someone who stopped choosing Olivia years ago." James nodded gently. "I think it's time Olivia chooses Olivia." James smiled. "That's never the wrong decision." Olivia thanked James and quietly walked away. James watched Olivia disappear into the crowd. Another stranger, another life, quietly changed. James realized something beautiful. Wisdom multiplies when it's shared. Several weeks later, James' company announced exciting news. James would become chief executive officer, the youngest CEO in the organization's history. Employees filled the conference room with applause. The board congratulated James. Journalists requested interviews. Business magazines wanted cover stories. Years earlier, James would have celebrated loudly. Instead, James returned to the office, closed the door, sat quietly, not because success meant little, because James understood something success could never teach. Every achievement eventually becomes yesterday's news. Character never does. That evening, James visited the familiar waterfront. The waves looked exactly the same as they had years ago. The same wooden bench still overlooked the bay. James smiled as another memory surfaced. The elderly man, the stranger who had appeared Whenever life became confusing, James hadn't seen the old man in years. James wondered what had happened, almost as if answering the thought. A familiar voice came from behind. James finally became the man James was always searching for. James turned around. The elderly man stood there, older, walking more slowly, but smiling exactly the same. James laughed. I thought James would never see the old man again. The stranger chuckled. Neither did the old man. They sat together, watching the waves. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence felt like an old friend. Finally, the elderly man asked, Does James still think Emma changed James' life? James smiled thoughtfully. No. The old man raised an eyebrow. No. James shook the head. Emma created the moment. But James made the decision. The old man smiled proudly. Exactly. The stranger picked up a small stone and gently tossed it into the water. People often confuse events with choices. The event belongs to life. The choice belongs to us. James quietly nodded. Years ago, those words would have sounded wise. Today, they simply sounded true. Before leaving, the elderly man handed James a small folded piece of paper. One last gift. James slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten quote. The strongest tree is not the one protected from every storm. It is the one that learned to grow because of them. There was no signature. None was needed. James folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the wallet. Some gifts become more valuable with time. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, James realized something extraordinary. Emma had once asked James to pretend James and Emma had never met. Life had answered that request in the most unexpected way. James never forgot Emma. James simply stopped allowing the memory to decide the future. That was the difference. Forgetting is impossible. Growing beyond the memory, that is freedom. And for the first time in many years, James knew the final chapter of this story was approaching. Not with revenge, not with regret, but with peace. 7 years had passed. 7 years since the night Emma stood outside a ballroom and asked James to pretend James and Emma had never met. Time had softened the memories, not erased them. Some moments are never forgotten. They simply lose the power to hurt. James no longer remembered that night with anger. James remembered it with gratitude. Without that night, there would have been no new life, no wisdom, no peace. James' name had become well known in the business world. Articles described James as a calm leader. Employees admired James' patience. Investors respected James' integrity. Journalists often asked the same question: what is the secret behind James' leadership? James always answered with the same sentence: people follow those who remain calm when everyone else is chasing control. Some thought it was a business strategy. James knew it was a life strategy. One winter morning, James received an invitation from Chicago. The company planned to celebrate its 50th anniversary. Former employees, executives, and business partners from across the country would attend. James looked at the invitation for a long time. Chicago, the city where everything had fallen apart. The city where everything had truly begun. For several minutes, James considered declining. Then James smiled. If the past still frightened James, perhaps the past still held power. James accepted. Snow covered the streets when James arrived in Chicago. The city looked different. New buildings had appeared. Old cafes had disappeared. Even the hotel where the charity gala had taken place had been renovated. Nothing remained exactly the same. James quietly realized something. Cities heal. People do too. The anniversary celebration filled the ballroom with laughter and conversation. Executives shook hands. Old colleagues embraced. Music played softly in the background. James greeted familiar faces from years ago. Many were surprised by how calm James had become. One former co-worker laughed. James used to overthink everything. James smiled. Life eventually teaches everyone what deserves attention. As the evening continued, James stepped onto the outdoor terrace for fresh air. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the night. The city lights reflected against the frozen river. The same river James had walked beside years earlier. Footsteps approached behind James. There was no need to turn around. James already knew. Emma stood beside James, wrapped in a dark blue winter coat. The years had been kind to Emma, not because Emma looked younger, because Emma looked peaceful. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Emma smiled. "Chicago looks beautiful tonight." James nodded. "It always did." Emma quietly laughed. "James always noticed beauty. I usually noticed opportunity." James smiled. Maybe both were necessary. Emma nodded. Maybe. The silence between James and Emma no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. Emma finally broke it. James became everything James dreamed of. James looked toward the skyline. Not everything. Emma looked confused. "No." James smiled softly. James dreamed of a perfect life. What James received was a meaningful one. Emma slowly nodded. "I think that's better." James agreed. "So does James." Emma reached into the pocket and removed something small, an old silver key. James recognized it immediately. The key to the apartment James and Emma had once shared. Emma placed it into James' hand. Emma found it while moving. James looked at the tiny key. Such a simple object. Once, it had unlocked a home. Now, it unlocked only memories. Emma smiled gently. James should keep it. James shook the head. "No." James carefully closed Emma's hand around the key. "It belongs to Emma." Emma looked surprised. But it was James' apartment, too. James nodded. "It was... But James doesn't live there anymore." The words meant far more than the apartment. Emma understood immediately. Tears quietly filled Emma's eyes. Emma spent years wishing for another chance. James listened. Emma continued. "Now." Emma only wishes James continues being happy. James smiled warmly. James hopes the same for Emma. For the first time, there was nothing left unsaid. No hidden expectations. No unanswered questions. Only two people who had finally accepted the truth. Emma looked toward the ballroom doors. Someone is waiting for Emma. James followed Emma's eyes. A man stood inside, smiling patiently. Not Daniel. Someone new. Someone who looked at Emma with quiet respect. James smiled. "I'm glad." Emma looked surprised. "Really?" James nodded. Everyone deserves another chapter. Emma's eyes became emotional once again. James already gave Emma one. Emma hesitated, then quietly asked, "Can Emma ask one last question?" James smiled. "Of course." Emma took a deep breath. Did James ever hate Emma? James looked toward the falling snow, thought carefully, then answered, "No." Emma looked relieved. "I hated the pain. I hated the confusion." But James never hated Emma. Hate would have forced James to carry Emma forever. I wanted freedom instead. A single tear rolled down Emma's cheek, not from sadness, from understanding. Emma stepped forward. For a brief moment, James and Emma embraced, not as lovers, not as people searching for another beginning, simply as two human beings who had survived the same storm from different sides. When they stepped apart, both were smiling. Emma quietly said, "Goodbye, James." James answered, "Take care, Emma." Emma walked back toward the ballroom. James never looked back, not because James didn't care, because some goodbyes become complete only when we stop turning around. Later that night, James walked alone through downtown Chicago. The snow continued falling. The city was quiet. James reached a bridge overlooking the river, where years earlier an elderly stranger had spoken about water finding another path. James leaned against the railing. The river still flowed, calmly, patiently, never arguing with the rocks. The old man had been right. Strength had never been about pushing harder. Strength had always been about continuing forward. James smiled. The story that began with heartbreak was no longer a story about loss. It had become a story about transformation. Emma had given James pain. Life had given James wisdom. James had chosen peace. And that choice had changed everything. As the cold wind carried snow across the river, James realized one final truth. Sometimes, the greatest victory is not getting back the person who left. It is becoming someone who no longer needs them to stay. 10 years passed. 10 years since Emma asked James, pretend James and Emma had never met. The memory still existed, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like an old photograph, something James could look at without pain, something that reminded James how far life had traveled. Time had not erased the past. Time had simply placed it where it belonged, behind James. Seattle greeted another peaceful sunrise. James stood on the balcony overlooking Elliott Bay with a warm cup of coffee. The city was waking up. Ferries crossed the water. Joggers filled the waterfront. The mountains stood silently in the distance. Some people believed peace came from having everything. James knew better. Peace came from needing less. Life had become wonderfully ordinary. James still woke before sunrise, still exercised, still read philosophy every morning, still walked along the waterfront every evening. The routine that once helped James survive had become the foundation of a meaningful life. Success had never changed those habits, because success without discipline eventually becomes pride. Discipline without success still becomes character. James chose character. Every single day, the company had grown into one of the most respected organizations in the country. Employees admired James not because of authority, because of consistency. James remembered birthdays, listened more than speaking, accepted responsibility before assigning blame. Young leaders often asked, how does James remain so calm during difficult situations? James always smiled before answering. When life has already broken the heart once, small problems stop looking like disasters. One spring afternoon, James received a handwritten invitation, not from a company, not from a university, from the local community center. The director wanted James to speak to teenagers struggling with anxiety, rejection, and uncertainty. Many advisors suggested declining. There isn't much publicity. There are no important investors. There are no cameras. James smiled. Then, perhaps it is the most important audience. The community hall was small. Old wooden chairs filled the room. Nearly 50 teenagers sat quietly. Some looked nervous. Others looked completely disconnected. James walked onto the stage carrying nothing except a notebook. No presentation. No slides. No prepared speech. Only experience. James looked across the room, then quietly began. Every person sitting here will lose something. The room became silent. A dream, a friendship, a relationship, an opportunity, perhaps all of them. Several students lowered their heads. James continued, life is not unfair because it takes. Life is honest because it changes. A young boy raised his hand. What if someone destroys James' life? James smiled gently. No one could destroy James' life. The boy frowned. But people betray people. James nodded. Yes, they betray trust. They betray promises. They betray love. But they cannot destroy character. They can only reveal whether character was already strong enough to survive. The room became perfectly still. A young girl spoke next. What if James never gets an apology? James looked at her kindly. Most people spend years waiting for an apology. James spent years waiting too. She looked surprised. Did James ever get one? James smiled. Yes. But James had already healed before it arrived. The girl quietly whispered, so it didn't matter anymore. James nodded. Exactly. Healing begins the moment we stop making someone else responsible for our peace. Another student asked, how does James forgive someone who caused so much pain? James walked slowly across the stage. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean trusting someone again. It doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means refusing to carry yesterday into tomorrow. The students wrote quietly inside notebooks. James continued, hatred feels powerful, but hatred quietly asks us to keep reliving the same injury. Peace asks us to put the weight down. After the talk ended, students surrounded James with questions. One young man remained standing near the doorway. He looked familiar. James walked over. Everything all right? The young man smiled nervously. My father used to work with James. James looked closer. Recognition appeared. The young man was Daniel's son. James had never met him before. My name is Ethan. James smiled warmly. It's nice to meet Ethan. Ethan held out a small envelope. My father asked Ethan to give this to James if Ethan ever met James. James accepted it carefully. Inside was a single folded page. Daniel's handwriting. James. If life somehow allows this letter to reach James, then Daniel hopes James is smiling more than remembering. James continued reading. Daniel spent years believing strength meant winning. Cancer taught Daniel something different. Strength means leaving the world a little kinder than Daniel found it. Thank James for teaching Daniel that lesson without ever trying. James quietly folded the paper. A peaceful smile appeared. Daniel's story had finally reached its ending. As the hall slowly emptied, James walked outside. The evening sky glowed with the colors of sunset. Children laughed in a nearby park. Parents pushed strollers. Birds crossed the orange horizon. Life continued, beautifully, ordinarily. James sat on a wooden bench, overlooking the water. The same kind of bench where an elderly stranger had once changed everything with a few simple sentences. James looked around. The old man was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had passed away. Perhaps life had simply carried him elsewhere. Either way, his lessons remained. James removed the old folded paper from the wallet, the one the elderly man had given years ago. The strongest tree is not the one protected from every storm. It is the one that learned to grow because of them. James smiled. After all these years, the sentence still felt alive. James looked across the calm water and finally understood the lesson life had been teaching all along. Strength was never raising the voice. Strength was never proving someone wrong. Strength was never making Emma regret the past. Strength was quietly becoming someone the past could no longer control. Emma's decision had changed one night. James' decision had changed an entire lifetime. That was the difference. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we choose to respond. James had spent years discovering the truth hidden inside those words. Pain is inevitable. Bitterness is optional. Loss is inevitable. Hopelessness is optional. People will disappoint us. That is part of being human. But allowing disappointment to define us, that is always a choice. As the last light disappeared beyond the horizon, James stood and took one final walk along the waterfront. Every step felt lighter than the one before. No unfinished conversations. No unanswered questions. No desire for revenge. Only gratitude. Gratitude for every mistake, every tear, every lonely night, every lesson. Because without those moments, James would never have discovered the person quietly waiting beneath the pain. The strongest people stay quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have finally learned that peace never needs a shout. If this story reminded you that your greatest strength is found in your response, not in your circumstances, then carry that lesson with you today. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more original stories about resilience, wisdom, and the quiet strength that changes lives. The strongest victory is not changing someone else's heart. It is refusing to lose your own.